On July 1st, it was time to get back on the road. As always, it was hard to leave after having had such a great time over the past few days, but the year wasn't getting any younger, and I still had a lot of biking ahead of me. I gratefully accepted my sister's offer to drive me out some 65 miles west to Cortez, Colorado. This gave me a day up on my plans, and also saved me a challenging ride full of hills. From Cortez, I said my goodbyes and got on the road west, leaving behind my last sibling. It was a majority downhill ride as I followed the meandering county road through the red landscape. I was both surprised and a little sad by how quickly we had left behind all the greenery and mountain views. To my frustration, my knee was still giving me some issues, even with all the days off. But without too much trouble, I crossed over into Utah and reached Bluff, where I grabbed some supplies before cycling a few miles outside of town to the Sand Island campsite. There was a rock wall full of ancient petroglyphs that was located at the campsite, so I checked it out before settling in for the night. The next day, I got on Route 191 south and angled down towards Arizona. I crossed over into the Navajo Reservation and settled in for a long day of barren landscapes. There wasn't much along the way to my destination, and the seemingly unchanging views made for a long day. The wind picked up later in the afternoon. It was blowing pretty hard out of the west by the time I slowly cycled into Kayenta. It's against the law to camp out on the reservation without special permits, and so I set to finding a motel for the night. To my great disappointment, Kayenta is home to only 3 options, the cheapest of which had no vacancy that night. And so, by virtue of being the only option available, I spent the night at the outrageously priced hotel on the corner. I walked out of the hotel to a windy morning. The initial hour of riding was fairly challenging, and I wasn't very optimistic for the day ahead, but thankfully it didn't get any worse. It was another empty ride as I continued southwest through the reservation. About 20 miles outside of my destination, I heard a familiar snap. I stopped and quickly looked over my bike, but didn't immediately see anything, so I continued on my way to Tuba City. Once in town, I did a more thorough inspection and found that I had broken another spoke on my rear wheel. With no bike shop around, I worked on finding a place for the night. Still on the reservation, I was thankfully able to find a last-minute listing on Airbnb that, while still expensive, was much more manageable than the previous night's stay. I left Tuba City early on the 4th. With my broken spoke in mind, I had found that the nearest bike shop was located in Flagstaff, about 80 miles south. Because of logistics, I decided to put it off for a day and instead head west towards the Grand Canyon. I was anticipating a tough day of hills, and so I tried to savor the first 28 miles of mostly downhill riding as much as I could. Once I turned onto Route 64, the climbing started and just kept on going. The upside of getting up higher was that I was leaving behind the red dirt in favor of the trees of the Kaibab National Forest. I eventually passed into the Grand Canyon National Park and began to get hit by the short, steep hills. It was definitely one of my more challenging rides, but it was worth it to see the canyon. It was crazy to see in person and to truly appreciate just how massive it really is. I hung around the Desert View lookout point for a couple of hours, resting and taking in the sights before getting back on the bike. I rode the 25 miles of winding, narrow road to Grand Canyon Village. Along the way, I stopped a few times to get different perspectives of the canyon, and each didn't fail to amaze me. It was a mostly downhill stretch, and I was enjoying the relatively effortless ride following the canyon's edge. I was able to get on the South Rim Trail for a bit, which offered great views of the canyon. It wasn't too long before I reached my destination. With it being the 4th of July, The campground in town was full, so I biked around for a bit before finding a quiet spot out of the way. The next morning I headed down towards Flagstaff. It was somewhat chilly with me being north of 7,000 feet, but it was a welcome change from the last couple of days. Before leaving, I sent out a last-minute request to a host in Flagstaff who I had actually met briefly while she was touring through Charleston, South Carolina, way back in April. I was super excited when she got back to me, welcoming me over. I let gravity do most of the work for me for the first 30 miles before turning southeast on Route 180. With my big downhill gone and having tackled the climb up to the canyon the day before, my legs were pretty beat. I entered the Coconino National Forest and struggled a fair bit through the somewhat hilly stretch of road. Somewhere along the way, I cycled my 5,000th mile of the trip. By that point, I was really feeling the rear wheel rubbing up against the brake pad, and I was beginning to question my earlier decision to put off getting the spoke replaced. But I finally got past the hills and hit a very long downhill portion that brought me about 15 miles, all the way to my host in Flagstaff. It was really cool to see her again, all the way from Charleston, South Carolina to Flagstaff, Arizona. She helped me out by driving me and my bike downtown to get it fixed, and even treated me to some gelato before heading back to the house. I settled in for the rest of the day, very glad to be off the road, and looking forward to taking the next day off. At her invitation, I joined my host and her friends to a morning out on the water south of the city. I was able to take a spin around in one of the inflatable kayaks, and even got to test out my balance on one of the paddleboards. It was a very relaxing time out, and I really liked being able to do a physical activity other than being on my bike. The stop in Flagstaff was a welcome break from the heat of the past week, and I enjoyed the rest of my time in the city. On July 7th, I left Flagstaff and got back on I-40 heading west. It was a downhill ride, and while I had a lot of fun letting gravity do the work, I couldn't help but feel sad about leaving behind the higher elevation. There was a crosswind that picked up later in the day, which kept things interesting, but it was nothing too crazy. Understandably, the traffic on I-40 was pretty high, and so I had plenty of company all the way to my destination of Seligman, Arizona. It was a Route 66 town through and through, and it was interesting to see the tiny main drag full of Route 66 signs and memorabilia. My 14th week ended in Seligman, Arizona, en route to Las Vegas and the West Coast.